Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Damon. Welcome to week 3 of online learning. I hope it's going well for all of you. I hope it's not super frustrating or super confusing. As always, if it ever is, just make sure you're reaching out to me and reaching out to your teachers so that we can help you, make it through this online learning. I created a big presentation about what makes a poem because our first unit is about poetry. So this is a long presentation. Please don't freak out about that. I am making 2 videos for it. So this first video covers the first 2 sections of the presentation, and my video later this week will cover the last section. So I'm going to take it in chunks because I know it's a lot of information. So I'll present this to you now, and I apologize for not having my video on the screen. My camera is acting wonky today, so my apologies. But yeah, this presentation is basically like what makes a poem? Like, why is a poem and not something else? Before we start analyzing poetry, before you start writing your own poetry, we have to understand what a poem is, right? So I've got some vocab words for you on this presentation. I will expect you to know them, and it's going to help us better discuss poetry and analyze poetry. And once you know the parts of a poem and what they can look like and sound like and feel like, it will of course make it easier to write your own poem. So if you've never written a poem before, it's totally fine. I want you to think of the following concepts and ideas that I'm sharing with you as the building blocks of poetry. Not all poetry has all of these things that I'm going to mention. It's just the basics of what most poems have. So, what is a poem exactly? I shared a bunch of things that describe what a poem is. So, a poem is a piece of writing that's typically meant to be spoken out loud or even sung. It is very often rhythmical. It's something that can arouse strong emotions in the reader or listener. It is very, very emotion heavy, usually. It's writing that's focused on an imaginative awareness of experience. So it's very fun, it's very free, and it's a piece of writing in which the words are chosen for their beauty and sound. So word choice is super, super, super important in poetry, even more so than in books or short stories. So making a great poem requires a lot of cool elements all coming together into one thing. The structure of a poem is very important, the language and the sound of the poem are important, and the presentation and performance of poetry are very important. And that's how I'm going to break up our presentation, is by those 3 things. So first, let's talk about structure. These vocab words are what I will expect you to know in this class as far as structure goes. So here is a poem, and I just kind of pointed out some of the things that I'm about to talk to you about. So of course you have the title of a poem at the top of the page. You put it in quotes when you're talking about a poem. You've got the name of the poet, and then you've got lines within the poem. We will talk more about exactly what a line is, and you also have things called stanzas in the poem. So I'll show you what that is. So a line can be defined in poetry as the basic subdivision of a poem. It's specifically a group of words arranged into a row that ends for a reason other than the right-hand margin, and it conveys a single strand of thought. That's a lot wordier and probably more confusing than me actually just showing you examples of lines. So let me do that here. This is the beginning of the poem I just showed you in the last slide. These first 2 lines of text here are a line of poetry, and this line of text here is a line of poetry. When I say lines of text, I literally mean like this is a line and then it stops, and then this is a line and this is a line and this is a line. But a line of poetry is basically a single strand of thought. So the first line of this poem is, in an effort to get people to look into each other's eyes more. Okay, that's a single strand of thought. And it takes up it takes up 2 lines of text because the thought isn't finished at look. right? It continues on to the next line of text. And it stops actually when you have that comma there. This is an example of a line of poetry that is one line of text, right? It's a whole strand of thought. I am adjusting well to the new way. It just happens to fit on one line of text, but it doesn't have to. And lines are often separated by punctuation like periods, commas, dashes, etc. So this first example of a poetic line is an example of that. It ends with a comma. Okay, a line break is the end of a line of text. So literally there's a line break at each end here. There's a line break at look, at more, at mutes, at decided, at hundred, at day, right? So it's where the poet decides to end the line of text. So every single line of text has a line break, and that's where the author decides to end the line to start a new one. Some line breaks have punctuation at the end, like this one, after day, and some don't, like this one, after restaurant. It's all up to the author. So based on whether or not a line of text ends with a grammatical structure or not, will determine whether the line of text uses enjambment or whether or not it has an end stop. So enjambment is the continuation of a thought from one line of text in a poem to another without punctuation at the end. So if you look at the line that has 100 at the end of the line of text, that's an example of enjambment. The thought continues to the next line of text with no punctuation. Okay, versus an end stop. An end stop is the exact opposite of enjambment. So that's when a line of text in a poem ends with a punctuation mark. Remember, a punctuation mark doesn't have to just be a period. It can be a question mark, an exclamation point, a comma, a dash, right? Any of those are fine. So this line of text has an end stop because it ends with a comma. This line has an end stop because it ends with a period. Okay, but the two above it end with enjambment. They are not stopped by any sort of punctuation. A stanza, I want you to think of a stanza as basically the paragraph of a poem, okay? It's a grouped set of lines. So these first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, these first 6 lines of text are one stanza, and the following 4 lines of text are also a stanza. So again, think of it as the paragraph of a poem, okay? All those lines grouped together because they're talking about a single idea or concept. Now we'll talk about language and sound in poetry. These are the vocab words that I want you to know for my class. So, there is almost always rhythm in poetry, even if it's not super, super easy to tell. The definition of rhythm is the beat and pace of a poem. And it's created not by necessarily like music having to be played behind it, although it certainly can be. But what it's actually created by is a pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables in a single line of text or multiple lines of text. And I'll show you examples of that. When you have rhythm in poetry, it helps to strengthen the meaning of words and ideas in the poem. So let me show you what I mean by that. A pretty clear example, sorry for my picture being in the way, of rhythm in a poem is Humpty Dumpty. Technically, it's a nursery rhyme, but we can also call it a poem. And most of us would say this nursery rhyme in a super same or similar way because it has a very clear rhythm. So when I say Humpty Dumpty, I always say it the same way. I say, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Okay, so nursery rhymes have very, very distinct rhythms, and we can hear it, right? Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Da 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 da. Right? It's very, very distinct. And a lot of poems don't have that super distinct rhythm, but it is still there. Another example that's a little bit harder to tell, but definitely still there, is Edgar Allan Poe's Annabel Lee. So if you read it out loud, there's clearly a rhythm going on based off of how you say the words and how you say them when they're next to each other. So part of the poem reads, "She was a child and I was a child in this kingdom by the sea, but we loved with a love that was more than love. I and my Annabel Lee." When you say it, there's certain stresses that we put on words that create a rhythm. She was a child and I was a child. Da 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 da. Right? And it's initially hard to find, but poetry typically has some sort of rhythm going on. And when you say it out loud, especially, that's when you can hear it. Figurative language and rhetorical devices. I'm sure you have learned about figurative language in your English classes before, and poetry absolutely uses figurative language. I mean, just a lot. So, examples of figurative language in poetry are especially going to be like similes and metaphors, right? So, similes and metaphors are when you compare two unlike things to create connections to the world and to the reader. So a thought that I have might not be a thought that you've ever had, but if I compare it to something that you know, then we can connect as reader and author. Personification and onomatopoeia are also examples of figurative language, and they can help convey complicated or abstract ideas and sounds in poetry. And as far as rhetorical devices go, things like imagery and illusion are ways that can persuade you to keep reading. It literally like holds your eyes to the page. You can't look away. You're wanting to read more because you are very, very into and invested in the words on the page. So we can go over that more in detail later, but this is just the basics. And then rhyme. Definition of rhyme that I go by is a repetition of similar sounds in the final stressed syllables and any following syllables of two or more words, right? So rhymes happen when the ends of words sound the same, right? Often we use rhymes for effect in the final positions of lines of poems and songs. So the focus tends to be on the rhymed words. Okay, it doesn't have to be, but it often is. Does a poem need to have rhymes to be considered a true poem? Absolutely not. There are so many different kinds and formats of poems in the world. Some require rhymes, some do not. It's totally up to the authors, totally up to the writer, whether or not the poems that you write in this class rhyme. I'm never going to force you to rhyme or not rhyme in your poems. Okay, so that's the first two stages of this presentation. Later on in this week, I will come back with a video about the presentation and performance in poetry. But for right now, hopefully you understand more about the structure and the sound and language in poetry. We will discuss these more in detail later, but like I said, this is just sort of a basic what the heck is a poem. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed that, and I hope this helps you with some of the assignments that I'm going to have you do this week. Please let me know if you need any extra assistance. As always, thanks very much, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.